What's up, everybody? Welcome to another edition of the breakdown. Um, so it's SEC Media Days. They're obviously talking to Butch Jones right now, talking about Tennessee. So when you see SEC Media Days, that right there tells you that college football is right around the corner. Video's a little bit more fuzzy. Uh, Recording this from the phone this time, but hey, it's all the same to me. So anyway, let's get into this. I mean, they're in Hoover, Alabama. All these reporters. I just want to make this video and say, I mean, the SEC. It's been a good conference the last 6, 7, 8 years, probably the last 10 years. The SEC right now is not the SEC that it has been. There used to be this stigma that teams from outside the SEC could not beat SEC teams, and for a long time that remained true. Unless you were talking about the what you call bottom feeders, teams outside of the SEC really couldn't come into the SEC and beat SEC teams. That's going to be a tough one right there for Tennessee, Oklahoma. Well, I'll get to that later. But that used to be true. I mean, the SEC back then had 12 teams, and I would say like your top eight teams. Your top eight teams could go and beat anybody from any conference. They could go beat the number. I mean, you could have like the SEC's sixth and seventh team go beat the number one team from other conferences. Or if they didn't beat them, they would give them quite a tough game. And so that right there showed you how good the SEC was. I don't think that holds true now. I think we saw that towards the end of last year with Oklahoma beating Alabama. And just to dive into that a little bit, Oklahoma beat Alabama fair and square. Alabama was ready to play because they jumped on OU and they went back and forth for most of that first half, and then OU took over the game. So Alabama was ready to play. They were motivated. They didn't respect Oklahoma, and that's why they got beat. But they were ready to play. Florida State beat Auburn. I think Florida State was the best team in the country last year, and I thought that even before Alabama lost to Auburn. So I think what we're seeing now is that some of these teams outside of the SEC can actually step up against SEC teams and beat SEC teams. The SEC teams are not invincible to teams outside of their prospective conference, and I think that those days are over. The Oklahomas of the world, the Oklahomas of the world. Oklahoma can play with anybody in the SEC, and I think they proved that last year by beating Alabama. They're going to play Tennessee this year, and they're going to prove that once again. I expect Oklahoma to win the game, but I mean, you never know. I mean, college football is it's a weird thing. Tennessee, although they didn't have a great season last year, they could be the best thing since sliced bread this year. But as it sits right now, I expect Oklahoma to win. Oklahoma's got the momentum. Oklahoma should be better than they were last year too. So, and they're playing at home, so that never hurts. I think Florida State could beat anybody in the SEC. I think Baylor could step in and beat anybody in the SEC. I think Ohio State can step in and beat anybody in the SEC. I think Stanford can beat anybody in the SEC. Now, can the SEC teams beat all the teams I just named? Sure, they can. But I just don't think this aura of the SEC that they're invincible. I just don't see that, and I think we saw that towards the end of last year. Oklahoma beating Alabama and Florida State breaking the streak and finally beating an SEC team. So with that being said, I just don't think the SEC is as good as it used to be, and I think Bob Stoops was right. He said the SEC was top heavy. Texas A&M gets a whole lot of credit. The Texas A&M is the most talked about four-loss team I've ever seen. This team, out in the 2 years they've been in the SEC, the 2 years they've been in the SEC, outside of the Alabama win, who else have they beaten that's been any good in the SEC? Nobody. Every good team they play, they lose to them. They lost to LSU twice. They lost to Florida when Florida was good. Lost to Missouri when Missouri got good. Lost to Auburn when Auburn got good. So I just don't, the SEC. I mean, A&M. I mean, the 9-4. I mean, they did stuff like that in the Big 12. I mean, they would pull off 9-4 seasons in the Big 12, and that's how A&M. That's how A&M gets their hype, because in the Big 12 they may pull off a year where they made a beat Oklahoma, or maybe they beat a Texas, but lost to everybody else who was good, and then all of a sudden they might have beat one of those teams towards the end of the season, and then they let that single win carry them over into the next year with a lot of hype behind them. And that's what I think Texas A&M is now. Is that they're just a lot of hype. I mean, like I said, that's the most hype 4-loss team I've ever seen, because anybody else that has 4 losses wouldn't be getting the hype that A&M has, but deservedly so. I mean, Johnny Manziel's been there the last couple of years, and so we just have to let this Johnny Manziel phase pass us by. But as far as the SEC, and speaking of Johnny Manziel, there he is on TV. As far as the SEC, I just don't see it as being that premier conference like that anymore. I mean, let's get back to Bob Stoops. Bob Stoops said that the SEC was top heavy, and I'd agree with Bob Stoops. The SEC they've got a couple of good teams, and then the rest of the teams aren't that great. I mean, Arkansas is terrible. Kentucky's not that good. Vanderbilt's not that good. Tennessee has not been that good lately. Mississippi State is okay. Ole Miss, they're okay. I mean, these are a bunch of teams that just aren't that good. Florida wasn't good last year, but I expect them to be better. The teams in the SEC that are good, I mean, you got 14 teams. So you got Alabama, you got Auburn, you have LSU. Texas A&M's okay, so they're competitive, so I'll throw them in the mix. So what is that? 4 teams, and then you have Georgia and you have South Carolina. So that's 6 teams. That's less than half of your conference is competitive. The rest of the teams fall by the wayside. The rest of the teams can be beaten by anybody in any conference. So the SEC is supposed to be this great thing of a conference. I mean, I would say that the Pac-12 last year was top to bottom more competitive. The Pac-12 had Arizona State. USC was competitive, although they weren't that great. UCLA was competitive. Oregon, Stanford, Washington, Utah. I mean, top to bottom, the Pac-12 was competitive, and a couple of years ago, the Big 12 was competitive, top to bottom. The Big 12 still is competitive, top to bottom. The ACC was competitive, top to bottom. You had Florida State, Clemson, Miami. Who else? Duke. North Carolina. They were decent. I mean, these are top to bottom leagues. The SEC is a top heavy league. So I just think that as we go on, we're going to start seeing more of these teams from outside of the SEC beat SEC teams. We're going to see it. And I sorry to say for all you SEC folks, but the conference is a little bit overrated, and nobody's afraid to go play you guys. So with that being said, I am out.